Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the broadcast. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. We do weekly Zoom chats with the group to discuss current events, shoot the breeze on World War III, the algorithm ghetto, all that fun stuff. I also do a weekly roundup of the news, headlines, and commentary, which is available only to paid subscribers over at the Substack. You can also send donations through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box Wise. Other options are all over the website. You can also consult with me if you need to chat about expatriating, geopolitics, or the meaning of life. And do check out all of my wonderful affiliates: Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone, Escape the Technocracy, Legal Shield, Easy DNS. There might be a few that I've forgotten. And leave a podcast review, please, if you have not already. And joining us for the first time on Geopolitics and Empire is David DuByne of the Adapt 2030 channel and Civilization Cycle podcast, where he discusses timelines for what you can expect from now through 2030 as society resets so you can keep your families safe. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, David.
Thanks for having me on. And, you see the world moving in a different direction. And, when we were on a show previously together, we were sort of saying that it was going to move out. Food shortages, or not global famine, but food shortages and inavailability of food was going to start to rear its head, and you're going to look for massive price increases that would affect the greater economy. And then here we are now, where people complain every day, and they have those memes. The most expensive vehicle to operate in 2024 is a shopping cart. You've seen all these. And then BRICS just finishes up their meetings 2 days ago, and they're saying they want to include silver now as one of the base metals for their currency, along with gold and platinum. So you start to look at this and say, wow, you can understand there's a few things happening, but why are they all happening right now? This is such a gargantuan change in world history. And you know it better than I on the political side of, ebbs and flows of different chapters and eras of our civilization going back 5,000 years or so. But why now? Because you look at different places around the world and you see distinct changes. It's literally like a line in the sand, a mark that demarcates that was then, this is now. And that line is so distinct, especially in Europe. If you travel around looking in the museums, that changeover from the Greek to Roman era, destroyed statues, like they had really demarcated, that had ended, and we are starting anew again. So I believe we are starting anew again right now, and we're in the process. It's not going to be a one-day event where, wow, it just changed, but it's a series of events that has unfolded, and is still in progress. And the end date, I don't really know when this transition period will finish, but we know we're in the amplification phase right now.
I mean, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, just looking at the BRICS winding down, checking out some of the speeches and documents, and there's a clear line in the sand. We've crossed the Rubicon. We're transitioning from one phase to another. It has begun. And just on the cost of living, my little napkin calculation from my vantage point here in Mexico, from what I see and experience and talking with friends and neighbors, we realized recently, for example, property prices in the last 10 years in Mexico, at least where I am, have tripled. So they've gone up 3 times in 10 years. Food has doubled, kind of, as you say, but wages have either stayed the same or decreased, which is, I mean, this is all insane. This makes no sense whatsoever. But we're here to get, I like to call it the David DuByne download. So, wherever you'd like to start, there's so much going on. There's the stuff going on in Carolina, near to, I think, where you are, World War III, the digital control grid, the economy, this transition phase, geoengineering, climate stuff. So, as I like to say, give us your theory of everything.
Oh, that's easy to string it together. Hey, I wanted to talk about Croatia for a second because, I told you before in our first time we talked, I really love the country. So we decided to go back for New Year's of this year, just at the beginning of 2024. And as we were there, it was the very last weeks to turn in the kuna. And everybody had moved over to 100% euros. So what had happened is people were super angry that they couldn't get access to the bank, because the only place that the last couple of weeks you could turn it in was actually the central bank in Zagreb. But it was coming into the holidays, so a lot of things are closed. So talking to the shop owners and things, for them also, just in general, the entire price of things just rose astronomically. And then some of the restaurants that we enjoyed last time we went back to, and talking to the owners, were saying that they were forced to buy squid from Spain instead of getting it just down coast because of those reciprocal import agreements, that they had to buy something delivered completely across the continent when they could have got the same exact product a couple hours away and supported local businesses. But under these new agreements, they were forced to, and everything just is really expensive. And seeing it firsthand, where something just went from, relatively normal prices to whoosh, almost doubling, and everybody's seeing it literally overnight when the native currency finished being used at all. That's really when these price holds, grabbed in. And I don't see the rest of the world being able to handle that if it were to increase, because then you need to look at the political stability of food pricing in general, and then just cost of living getting so high people can't afford anything else. So there is no entertainment, and people are getting angry. And I watched one of your interviews here. What was that? Oh, Clive Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, he talks about, people in Switzerland, you need to really work your tail off because there's 50 people in line behind you that want that high paying job. They want that very well-to-do country to live in. And it's coming down to this too. But if it's all work and no play, not because you're 50 people behind you, but because it's so expensive, every moment of your time is sniffing out resources so you can pay your basic daily needs. And, we're getting rather close to this in so many nations where it's at the point, if it goes very much higher on anything in cost of living, then you're going to cross that other magic line too, where people just won't be able to afford basic life, and it does get kind of boring where all you're doing is work on it because you need to pay rent, you need to buy food, and there's nothing else. There's no holiday, there's no downtime, there's no going out to the restaurants. Everything will, and at what point does it upset the global balance? And then looks like you talked about, what countries could you relocate to that might have a better advantage where their prices may remain more stable, there's better food choices, and they're not going to get hit with some sort of super inflation event.
Yeah, I mean, just you talking about the kuna right behind me. I've just got a few, I guess they're souvenirs now, Croatian kuna bills. And when that happened, I felt like my nation died, honestly, like in my heart, because that was our national currency. And if you don't have a national, you don't have a nation, in my opinion. And the EU is this supranational imperial globalist beast. And so we've been just eaten up by the blob. And so for me, my nation has died. And then I've got boots on the ground. Some of my listeners and subscribers, they're all over the planet, and maybe he's listening now. Shout out to one of my paid subs. He was he's a businessman. He was somewhere in Europe, I think last year, and he sent me an email of this story. The clerk of the hotel was a woman from Croatia, and he started a discussion with her and said that basically she confirmed that so many Croatians are fleeing Croatia because, as you were alluding to, no good work, high cost of living. The housing is everywhere. It's high from Mexico to Europe. So I think this is intentional. The BlackRocks of the world want to price the middle class out of owning property. And so, yeah, they're fleeing to Ireland. Croats are mostly going to Ireland these days, and Germany. And so it's a difficult situation. And so, yeah, your further thoughts on where we are and where we're going.
Well, the food production losses are going to continue because, as I've been surveying the news, especially in these last couple of months, there's these massive programs now to have people rip up their crops and not plant. And you saw in France, they were taking away 30,000 hectares of wine growing regions, different vineyard areas, that they were paying them now to cut the vines, till it back under, turn it into a rewilding project. But, that 30,000 hectares, which is over 60,000 acres, was more than the entire wine production of Switzerland. And you're starting to see this again and again. And then over in Spain, they wanted to tear down 1,000 acres of, production olive trees, this area, that next area, just to either put up windmills or solar panels. And it's either pay to stop farming or eminent domain land confiscation to put up these, green energy projects. But whatever I see, every time they do it, it's in a place that there is food production. I mean, this is literally death by a thousand cuts. We've had more than 500 food production facilities burned down in America here in the last, 18 months, 24 months. And I'm sure it's the same around the rest of the world. Maybe we're just not seeing all this very targeted news on how many facilities have burned down across Europe, how many facilities have burned down across Africa or, Asia. But I'm curious, once this middle class gets usurped and it no longer exists, where do these people go? It's easy now to move if you have resources to go to another place. But at some point, if you don't have resources, where do you move to?
I think
that's the question I don't have an answer for.
No, I think, because I've got other just questions. Like I wanted to ask, why do you think they're doing this? Because it's democidal. It's like in some ways suicidal, but these elites have, they have their Elysium. They live in their city state, so they don't, and they're not national elites, they're international elites. So the UK elites who are destroying UK don't care about the UK. They're globalists that float around the planet. I think what will happen is the smart cities, the 15, even the UN talks about this. I had a guest on not long ago who said, if in the old days, 80% of people used to live rural and like 20% urban, and that's flipped now. And UN's own projections, they talk about soon 70, 80% of populations living in urban areas. Urban areas will be the resilient cities, the smart cities. I'm in Guadalajara. Guadalajara is a smart, resilient city. This is crazy. Financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. The documents are there out in the open. So would you argue, why do you think they're doing this? And I think, doesn't it make sense that people will just flood into the urban areas? That's what happened with NAFTA here, USA, Canada, Mexico. When NAFTA went up to something like 2 million of Mexican farmers were put out of work, right? Because they rigged the prices of corn. So they made the U.S. subsidized corn in the U.S., which beat the price for Mexico. And now millions of Mexican farmers have to leave rural areas and move into Mexico City, to Guadalajara, to Monterrey. And so that makes sense for you?
It does. And I think the plan, of this destruction of the world's food supply is to get us on a centralized system. Now, if I can walk people that are listening, your mind out here for a second, we're into a substantial change on the Earth's magnetic field. And what this kind of cavitation and movement of it has not been seen in multi-thousands, plural, at 6,000 to 10,000 years prior is the last time that we're seeing this much movement in the Earth's magnetic field. Declining as well, not increasing in strength, but declining. So you have to look at it as these areas 45 north and above across the planet are really starting to struggle very visibly now with their crop production in terms of wheat and different kind of oats. And if you come a little bit further south, the sorghum, these sort of, amaranth, these types of secondary crops. So if we're not going to be able to grow what we traditionally did in parts of Canada, northern parts of North America here, or in Australia down, the southern part there going toward the Antarctic Circle, China's struggling up in the Heilongjiang area, massive floods. So there's a huge amount of crop losses here. But where it's starting to rain? Northern Africa and the Sahel. There's a huge amount of rain. Everything's coming back in again. The deserts are beginning to green. There's a huge amount of stories on how much rainfall is coming down. And what I had heard and done an enormous amount of research on, first, they're going to be paying the workers coming through with central bank digital currencies, stable coins, because if you come from Chad or you come from the UK or you come from Argentina, it doesn't matter if you're working in the Sahel to set up these new grow zones, you're going to be paid in something where 1 equals 1. So there's no, mix on the exchange rates when you head back to your home nation. And also with the global debt system, well, pretty much flat and very little, maneuvering. You can't really jam much more debt down anybody's throat, because at least where these nations have already, we grew up with that as a system to enhance our nations and expand them. It's kind of there's no more expansion where we've used, there's very little, you can't really ramrod it down there any longer. But if you were going to set up, say, the Sahel as a new growing zone, the multi-trillions of dollars that would be required for investment to put in road systems, waterworks systems, electrification. You got the new Renaissance Dam there in Ethiopia. That's Africa's largest hydroelectric project, and they're stepping 6 more down. And we're starting to see southern Sudan, massive floods everywhere across the Sahel, that whole area of Chad and Niger. And if you come all the way across there, some of the driest areas in Northern Africa are becoming wet again. And here's the thing, like, the UN had told them it's going to get drier, drier, drier. And their cities and villages followed the lakes that were drying out into these little pools of water, which were the previous African mega lakes. And now the rainfall is increasing and those lakes are starting to refill. But the problem is people have built right next to the shoreline following the drought over the last 40, 50 years down into the very bottom of the lakes. Those lakes are going to keep refilling. And the water levels are just going to get, deeper and deeper. And the possibility to restart the global debt system, control the food distribution of the planet, and that's where I see it moving to, is the ultimate control would be of food. Now, I can't really confirm it, but I heard some conjecture that the reason all these projects are going on for rewilding and buying out farms, et cetera, is to put the new growing zone in North African Sahel and control it as a single distribution point for the world's food supply. And if you don't play ball, then they would simply cut your country off because they want to consolidate all the world's food production in North Africa, the Sahel, part of the Middle East, which is larger than North America and Canada combined, and they can get a double rotation crop. So I don't know, it keeps coming right back to food again. And I know it's a long answer to answer your question here, but the reason why I see it is food to control the masses. And then to control for what purpose at the end? I never can come to that conclusion. Why? What's the final goal for the control mechanism?
Yeah, just to add, I think if I don't forget his name, Larry Freeman. I've had him on the podcast. He's really great. He actually works with the folks doing the dam in Ethiopia. So that's a great podcast people can check in the archive. And what you mentioned about the currency, the African Union, which is largely financed by the EU, because again, I've been saying for the longest time, the EU is the prototype for world government. You've got Southeast Asian Union, so they're replicating that model in Southeast Asia, ASEAN. They want it in North America, Central America, South America, and EU is pouring billions into Southeast Asian Union to replicate it there. They're assisting, technical assistance, financial assistance, African Union to replicate EU in Africa. And there's something called ECOWAS, where they're trying to create, and that region you talked about specifically, the West African states, ECOWAS, where they're trying to create a common passport with these multiple countries and the common currency. So that speaks perfectly to what you're talking about. And William Engdahl, great author. I've had him on probably half dozen times at least on the podcast. He's still alive, but old and not in the greatest health. Doesn't really do podcasts these days. But he's mentioned that with his research and books that Africa alone could feed the world, which is interesting. And because it's so what's the word? I mean, there's so much, it can grow so much, and it's so fertile, and so. Yeah, I would just assume, David, that they'll have the financial control, because this is world government, right? We're going into world government, so they'll have a one world political system, economic with the CBDCs, interoperable CBDCs, and then the food. And so basically, they don't want anyone being sovereign or independent. No.
I'm wondering if it's just a cycle through time that we're experiencing, and our history has been manipulated, where we don't have all the facts that. This circle from serfdom to where we have achieved some level of autonomy as a human, being able to think on our own here, and then the collective being still controlled, but the individuals allowed to have free thought and express that thought all the way back down, and that's torn away from us and brings us right back to feudalism again. And I'm just conjecturing, maybe it is woo-woo. Is it an 800-year cycle that comes back again? And our history that we have been told, there's missing bits of it here, there, and everywhere, that to achieve that goal, they're going to have to rip and tear down our society back to the bedrock and rebuild it. But there's going to be a lot of people like me that aren't going to be too happy with that. So, would it take one generation to reset it? 2 generations? And there's going to be a lot of people that aren't going to go quietly into the night on that too, that have seen the previous world that we used to live in. They're going to be like, wait, this one we're going to is a far worse choice. I'd prefer to take my chances back a decade or two ago in the world that was evolving then. So we've seen before and after, and there's how many people on the planet have seen before and after? Like you and I, every year we're getting older and older, and another 30 years or something, we're going to be the old old grumpy people that go, why are you always going? But we've seen both worlds. But the new kids born now, or the people who were born 20 years ago that are finally cognitive enough to be able to go, all right, well, this is happening in the world. And they kind of process the information. They never saw that old world. So for them, they're born right into this complete computer age, everything track traced. They're just like, I don't care. I don't have anything to hide. Who cares? You know, just all my stuff on the net. Okay, whatever. I'm very protective still. But this world is going to split, and they're taking us to this course, but to burn down the world, how many generations will the reset take? And did they know there would be some sort of natural cycle coming in at this point right now where they could achieve that goal in a much faster, smoother fashion because of electromagnetic changes on the planet, the Earth's magnetic field declining? Could they ride on top of a natural disaster cycle to achieve it? I'm just throwing those questions out there for anybody who has an open mind to think.
Let me just pull out this book right behind me. I got this on the recommendation of one of the listeners and former guest, Matt Smith, shout out, who works with Doug Casey, who's been on the show. Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. Massive book, but I think
I need to read that one.
But he talks about how I haven't read it yet. I've had it for like a year or two, but the idea that these cycles affect, these natural cycles of climate affect the political and economic systems and empires, and maybe on that, to get your further thoughts. Do you climate change? Do you view this as these natural climate cycles? And then there's also this talk of geoengineering by elites. What are your thoughts there?
Well, first, when we talk about changes on the planet, pollution is one of the worst things. And you're talking about microplastics and forever chemicals and oil spills, and these things are real and they have a very damaging effect. But when you're talking about a trace gas that's 4/100% in the atmosphere that's supposed to be cooking the planet, that doesn't make sense for me. Water vapor from the Hunga Tonga eruption putting 14% more moisture in the atmosphere, with the very active, unbelievably ramping up solar maximum that we're entering, and the water vapor canopy driving global temperatures, that makes more sense. Higher solar activity and 14% more moisture, because water vapor is one of the most, potent heat trappers, for a better term. So think about it. You would have to know the cycle's coming back again. And who has this knowledge? Because I also wonder about the late 1600s, after the little ice age and the modern minimum, right around that 1640 era, when that began and was really at its depths, where you could almost follow. If you go back and look where the witch trials were across, there's different kind of proxies that you can use. So there's witch trials, and Slovenia had the most witch trials when you're looking at that 300-year period. That culminated and ended in like mid 17 or prior to, say, the 1730, when that kind of all tapered off there. The witch trials, the most density of that was in Slovenia. So for me, if you're going to blame somebody or a group of people for the weather changing because they're doing spells and hocus pocus, whatever that the church had said they were doing at the time, then that would be one of the most greatly affected areas in Europe when these changes come. So I'm starting to look at these as sort of proxies. Okay, where was the second most witch trials happening? Oh, Austria. Okay, so you start to go, oh, well, those are mountainous ranges. Perhaps something had shifted in the glaciers, or, so I start to look at it, and then the amount of people who passed away during the time. There's gaps in records too, even in what we consider England gaps. Like, you don't have a 10-year gap in England. What happened? Well, they started raising smaller animals, obviously, because cows were requiring too much food. So they moved down to goats. There's this whole transition of animal husbandry during these times too. But the funerary rites, the invoices from the monks to do funerary rites on how many candle cases they ordered, also gives you an indication of, the population at the time and how much it declined. So that's not a long time ago. We're talking merely 300, 350 years prior. They had so much death, so much upset, the entire climate system ripped apart to the point where they're blaming women and burning them, putting them in prison and whatever else the church did at the time, because the weather changed, because the climate changed. And we're supposed to be the only ones ever in the last million years that changed the climate. Well, I would say, look back 300 years ago and see what happened. It was a tumultuous time on our planet. There was how much shift really occurred from the old world at that time, since like 1550 to 1600, and then fast forward into 1700, they went through a tremendous reset. That old world that they knew in like I say, year 1600 into the year 1700, that we're in a completely different world at that point. Technologically as well, government overseership, law, all these things had changed like that in just an instant.
What do you think then this phase transition, if you extrapolate, will look like? I keep having images of Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Mad Max. I mean, they just came out and said mainstream. I use only mainstream sources. I don't use People's Voice or different weird forums. Mexican papers said they're going to start dividing Mexico City, massive 25 million plus. You can't make a 15-minute city out of Mexico City, but they said they're going to divide Mexico City into multiple 15-minute cities. And that sounds like, Hunger Games, the districts they have in Hunger Games. What do you think this new epoch is sort of going to, the outlines of what it will look like in your mind? Will it be something like that? Or, James Howard Kunstler, who I've had on the podcast, talks about world made by hand. So it'll be more like horses and donkeys and carts or what?
Well, if you're going that way, see, we're back into the 800-year loop then, because we're right back at serfdom and feudalism in the way that people were so slow to transport goods, etc. And I'm just wondering if the cycle's been played before and that fingerprint sits across it over the millennia, that we're just been given a false history, at least to a point. The areas that we grow food are going to have the greatest upset. So when you look at a producing country that's now gone offline, I'll use Ukraine for a second, but it's in a war. So once the war stops, we can rebuild the infrastructure there to bring it back to the former great breadbasket it was, but that's going to take more than a decade. You look at how much damage has been done there. I mean, you're not going to repair that overnight. You're not just going to put up another fence and then, hey, we're back up to the 30 million tons for export out there available. Hey, that is absolutely going to take a decade or more. And, the amount of investment to go in there, as any war scenario, the rebuilding process, it's also involved. I see a bunch of little skirmishes across, like Myanmar's another one. Did anybody out there know in the 1960s, Myanmar produced more rice than China? They were the leading rice producer in Asia. But right now, they're only using about half, I'll just say 50% of their arable land. Like they can double and expand again another 50% of all the land usage. But a lot of place where there's different tribal groups up there and ethnicities that don't want to get off the land now. But wait, the plan is if they want to turn that back into a breadbasket, those people need to get out of there. And we're starting to see the same thing in North Carolina. Like they need that place for a purpose. And it's like, get out of there, eminent domain. So you don't ever really own your land. So to have this like bastion and pull back position, it can be stripped from you in a second. So I just see these different regional areas where food production is being affected, going further offline. And I'm just wondering when that awareness rollover is, we might not grow enough food on the planet this year to feed all, I don't know if there's 8 billion people any longer after what happened through the last few years, but 7 billion, there's going to be an awareness moment, and it's all going to be revolving around food. And then, how do they take that, these global elite, and how do they run with that and twist it and sew it into a fear-based, the shortage. You got to come here to this city, to this distribution point. Like in Chattanooga, it's a very small city in Tennessee, Chattanooga is a C40 city. And that's C40 is a group of mayors that have come up and want to implement the Agenda 2030 goals on an individual basis in their cities, on how many miles you can drive, how many clothes you can buy, how much meat you can consume. And I thought it would never happen in Tennessee. And here it is, C40 city in Tennessee. Knoxville is very much following that way too, Nashville. And even out here in what you consider like the very strongholds of personal freedom, it's a death by a 10,000 cuts. It's one little meeting over here. Oh, it's a town hall over there. It's a civic meeting here. And then suddenly you start to hear these same code words around that are being used at these, meetings in Brussels, but down here at the county on like a Tuesday night meeting for the town hall. Like insane that verbiage is being used micro from the entire planet is now starting to pick up. I don't care how small your town is. they are eyeing everybody for this change over here. And it's a global phenomenon. Time frame, again, I don't have a time frame on that, on expediency or how rapidly it can be implemented, and everybody falls under the umbrella.
It's happening in every single country. I track here in Mexico, the mayors in Mexico, the governors of the different states are working with the UN agencies, with the Rockefeller foundations, with the other foundations. They are implementing it here, and they're doing it in places like Mexico, which people view as, the third world. I mean, they're doing it in every nation on earth. You just got to go do a little digging. I'm curious as to, I don't know the answer to this question. I've had a lot of interesting folks on the podcast over the years. Gail Tverberg of Our Finite, I think, blog, Steve St. Angelo, many other folks. I don't really buy into the peak oil thing. Hubbard came up with that.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in abiotic oil, but I still think it can make sense that we can maybe reach some limits when it comes to resources. Do you think that there are limits to resources, or that elites are artificially shutting things down, or maybe, as you mentioned, the solar cosmic stuff is affecting everything?
Well, I would start back when we came off the bimetallic metal system and moved from gold and silver daily usage in, say, the 1850s here in America, and it just went to gold in early 1900s, and that was it. And they removed that silver facet out of it. I believe every single step of that way for the last 120 years has been completely controlled to devise plans to create that scarcity from day one until now. Have you ever flown on an airplane and you look down and there is almost nothing between those cities that you're flying to? And nature is bountiful and it's voracious and it just fills space. Myself having a farm, one little tiny seed, it's going to grow more than you can possibly eat, depending on what vegetable species it is. But also, we are battling every single year to keep our fields clean, because as soon as you let that go, like in one season, it's flat, nice mowed grass, field grass, and you come back and if you didn't take care of it, it's overhead high with the weeds in 1 week, or excuse me, in one season. And nature produces so much, endless. And if you want to go on the abiotic oil theory, well, then you would also need to go to primary water, which is part of the whole North African Sahel plan. Is the above ground water resources are absolutely increasing. Now, some would point to the West African monsoon, and to take a look at that pattern. It's a 4,000-year pattern. The amount of rainflow, and I've been tracking all these massive floods across Saudi Arabia, the right up tucked right to the Red Sea. So this massive amount of flooding seems to be happening in Western Saudi Arabia, right along the Red Sea. Like all these points from Mecca all the way down to Yemen are just, once in 1,000-year floods every single storm. So for me, it seems like the track, the way the wind would go, because, there's a 5,000-foot mountain range right along the Red Sea there as you come off the coast, seems to be hitting it direct versus coming down parallel, or it wouldn't capture that rainfall. But they have to also tap the underground water resources. And Gaddafi did that in Libya and was really starting to experiment with that water. And he was tapping into that primary water source. Like, we are fed the illusion that the only water that exists on the planet is just what's here on the surface in our lakes and rivers. But what about under your feet? Like, just the Nubian sandstone aquifer had something like 15,000 cubic kilometers. And then you go over to the Sus aquifer, which is another 12,000 cubic kilometers. And those are little tiny dots within Africa itself, North Africa. And then you look at really, there's hundreds of thousands of cubic kilometers of water that's never been tapped there. And it's very interesting with the sandstone there, because it fills in from the Atlantic Ocean, it fills in partially from the Indian Ocean, and then at the top there, it can come in from the Mediterranean, versus ours in the North American areas here, where it can only come from the Pacific Ocean for the refill, and maybe Gulf of Mexico, depending. So this scarcity that's been sold to us, we should have been using different patents for atmospheric harvesting of electricity, because I went to that Nikola Tesla laboratory in Zagreb, and they actually have working models of motors that spin against each other using magnets. When you're a kid and you push them together and they would repel, well, you put discs in when they spin, you do the same thing that you would need to burn coal to create the pressure to get a spindle to spin. working models in the laboratory there, Nikola Tesla laboratory, right downtown in Zagreb. And nobody's thought to, in the last 140 years, to go ahead and experiment with these. We have been sold scarcity. There is not scarcity. There is delivery system, and overcrowding is what we've been like corralled. When I was say corralled, we've been corralled into that. There is no such thing as scarcity. This earth is so abundant. Tremendously, it would boggle your mind how abundant our earth is. And what we're not getting told is what's beneath the crust that continually refills. I would agree oil. I would agree water as well. But again, those are finite resources, aren't they?
Yeah, I think, I'm sold on what you said. I've traveled the planet, and it's just vast open spaces filled with greenery, but most people want to live in the overcrowded cities, and then you've got these systems of control. Before asking you where are places to go, do you fear, did this threat of World War III, the nuclear specter, how serious do you take that?
I mean, I'm looking at it from a historical perspective, and please, I'm just going to say my piece on this one here. Since Hiroshima, we have in our collective militaries lit off over 2,000 different devices, underground, undersea, above ground, upper atmosphere. It doesn't matter. We've gone from the ionosphere with Starfish Prime all the way down to the Bikini Atolls and everything in between. 2,000 plus. And we are still here. So if it was a limited exchange where there might be two over there, couple here. Now imagine the terror, the panic that would create. But in the grand scheme of things, 4 nukes going off, 5, would it really do much? Not really on the entire planetary ecosystem, but for the mental health of the planet, it would go off the rails. So but just in a historical perspective, 2,000 of those devices have been detonated, and we are all still here. So a couple more of limited and smaller kilotonnage, I don't think it would have much of an effect on the environment. But I just repeated myself, so I'll stop.
I have the same view. I've lived near and visited one of the patches where they've dropped a quarter of those that you mentioned, the Polygon, 120 kilometers from Semei, Semipalatinsk, where I spent 3 years. And it's an 18,000 square kilometer section of the Polygon where Stalin dropped his first nuke in 49, and they dropped 500 plus there, above ground until early 60s when the treaty was passed. After that, underground. And I visited one of the ground zeros, radioactive patch of land. And so I don't buy into the nuclear winter theory. Sure, as you mentioned, if some nukes are dropped, a lot of people are going to die, which is horrible. But I don't think it's going to be some end of the world scenario. I think with a lot of stuff that we're discussing, they take a kernel of truth and then they blow it up. Like you mentioned, there's environmental pollution. Oh, but now climate change, CO2, we're all going to die. No, same thing with nukes, right? It's there's going to be a lot of death, but it's not going to be some nuclear, Terminator 3, Skynet, cold nuclear winter. Your thoughts on then? Where are some places maybe people can look into going? I mean, there's people listening in. There's folks that say Thailand is the best, Latin America. I often tell people sometimes it's best to stay where you are for different reasons. For other reasons, maybe go to some other parts of the planet. Your thoughts on relocation?
Again, if you have land and you're able to grow food and you have a clean water source and you're able to grow food with a community and you're near a farming community and it's off the beaten path I would hold there until you can't stay there anymore. Like there's no reason to just leave all those valuable resources. You know how many people would trade you in a millisecond to get to those clean land, clean water, safety zones that exist around in every nation. You just have to find them. Now, learning from what had happened in Ukraine, like even when I was looking at different spots to relocate to, Republic of Georgia was one, because they had 8,000 years of continuous wine production. So for me, that's a big one, because that means the climate didn't shift that much even during like massive cooling events of the different grand solar minimums through time, going back to the Greek minimum, 2500 BC, and they had one at 500 BC, and you get this whole string of them. You got the Oort minimum, the Sporer minimum, the Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum. Like these are pretty regular on 400-year cycles. Some more intense than others, obviously. But if you're telling me that they've had that winemaking for that long, and it never stopped, it's been continuous. And everybody's saying, well, where did the first grape seeds come, or the grape, cultivars come from? Well, and then you go back to stories of Noah's Ark and thing. Okay. But the point is, it's been continuous. And wine vines are very much a canary in the coal mine, just like oats are. Like if you're looking at oat production globally and you see massive declines in oats in certain producing regions like Volga in Russia, for example, climatically that something has definitely shifted. Oats are very finicky. Wine vines are very finicky. You need that right moisture, you need everything. So between maybe the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, I don't know, there might be a microclimate that exists between those two water bodies. And then I was looking at Sumba Island in Indonesia also. Massive, massive island. Hardly anybody ever goes there. It's right on the equator. The amount of food production there and sea life, like nobody really from Indo even wants to live there. They all want to stay up in Jakarta. They all want to stay up in, somewhere closer to Bali. They all want to be closer to where there's possibility to have quote unquote jobs. But if nukes were dropped, our economies would vaporize right along with that. And then you would be begging to get out onto a farm because those things known as jobs would no longer exist for a period of time, or be very, very limited to the most basic things, doctors, obviously farmers, but these kind of, service jobs and those in accounting and these kind of lawyers, that there's going to be nothing for you. It's going to come back to the very basics of keeping a society alive while that currency recorrects. And I don't know how long it would take, but those are my two choices and the reasons I chose those. But a nuke drop, everything financial is going to stop on a dime, and it's your papers are going to be pretty much worthless. And how long does it take to pick back up before people get that confidence again?
And even AI will, I think, again, I don't want to hype it, but I think it will go after certain segments of employment sector, as you mentioned. And so, I used to be a teacher, and we saw what they did with COVID. I heard stories from other teachers that I didn't lose my job, my contract finished, but you have a classroom of say 30 students, and COVID was part of their phase one to get to where we're going. And with COVID, you had one teacher who they let teachers go, and then one teacher would teach to 100 students, and it'd be online. And I think in the University of Adelaide, if I'm not mistaken, some university in Australia just recently announced they're doing away with in-person teaching. So it's going to be online, and then it'll probably be like Coursera. So you'll have like one teacher record. And so again, people need to, I think, focus on the world made by hand, have some plot of land, as you mentioned, water, food. I like Mongolia. I used to live in Mongolia.
Mongolia.
If I had married a Mongolian, I'm not single anymore, but if I were single, I'd go to Mongolia. Or if I had married a Mongolian, I would have ended up staying in the Gobi. And there you depend on the animal husbandry, so camels and horses, and it's a rough terrain. But I think it's also, I guess, I don't know. You think things are we going to a colder future?
I just did a video maybe 3 or 4 days ago talking about the Gobi Desert greening also. And China also put another very, very large hydroelectric dam up in Xinjiang, way up where there's hardly any rainfall coming out of the mountains. It's just mainly snow melt, but they must know something also. So you got some of the driest places in Africa. They installed the largest hydroelectric dams in Africa. And, that's a white elephant, too. When I first originally saw those news stories, I was like, oh, no, they're just white elephant. You're putting a hydroelectric dam here? That thing's never going to fill up. And it filled years in front of where they said it would take 7 years to fill up. And I thought it was a joke anyway that they would put it in the highlands there. Like, who's ever going to run? That's crazy. It filled 5 years faster than their forecasts, and it's already generating electricity. And that's the first foothold there to then step down dams and create the manufacturing zone. So if you're looking at believe it or not, South Sudan is going to be very wealthy because they're going to have constant electricity and setting up as an agricultural zone, export zone, and then they got the ports there at Port Sudan. So, you start to run all this out if they got constant electricity. Well, in Xinjiang also, up there putting a hydroelectric dam up in the desert, you're like, I understand the snow melt phenomenon, right? I get it. It melts every year. But to have the foresight of after the snow melts, your water's gone, that it's going to somehow replenish itself. And there's been massive rainfall all over the place up through Xinjiang, all the way over into Mongolia. Gobi Desert's greening as much as the Sahara Desert. I encourage anybody to look at the Middle East. These incredible photos coming out of Oman where lakes are forming in the desert, the amount of greenery just popping out of nowhere, Saudi Arabia and the empty quarters, just vast, like lakes filling up in between the sand dunes, like just vegetation takes off in an instant there, all the way across the Sahel, just massive green. When you look at the Earth Viewer, NASA Earth Viewer, you can see that really demarcated. Wow, look how much vegetation had moved up a couple hundred miles and the density of it. Gobi Desert's getting green. So I'm absolutely saying we are on a multi-millennia shift here, pattern of hydrological cycle. And again, does this all tie into why all this is happening now? Because the signs that the amplification is ongoing and is continuing to amplify is sort of, all right, the cycle's in earnest begun. Maybe they were waiting for the starting gun, but whatever those signals were that they were waiting for to jump and really enact a lot of this, well, it seems to have given the signal, because all these deserts regreening and then the Amazon's going into a mega drought phase. So something has shifted and is in process of shifting, and the extremes we've seen now are probably not going to be the most extreme that you'll experience. It's probably at the beginning of, very extreme, but we're going to get into extremely extreme. We're sort of in that midway, moving up to, wow, I can't believe that is even possible area.
You mentioned Oman just for fun. On the Apple charts in the politics category, geopolitics and empire hit #1 in Oman. I think Mozambique as well, Botswana. And so the charts shift, but it's fun to hit #1 in some of these countries. Have been #1 in Croatia as well, which is pretty cool. And the extremes that you mentioned here in Mexico, we have the rainy season, which begins from around May, June, July, August, dies down in September. A year ago, I had to install, I've been here for over a decade, right? And no, I'm not talking about global warming, man-made global warming, but we had a drought, severe in this year and last year, and it was so hot. The first time it's been so hot in my lifetime here, I had to install air conditioning. And so again, stuff is going on beyond some of the stuff that we've talked about. We talked about World War, nuclear wars, specter, the food, of course, that's going on, the algorithm, ghetto smart cities, the climate changes, solar cycles. Are there any other threats that are on your mind? Just what I'm thinking about. Another one could be Mad Max sort of scenario. What's that movie with based on Cormac McCarthy's book? I think The Road. The book is great, and the movie is pretty good too, with Viggo Mortensen, where if things do sort of collapse, maybe for a while, we might have to worry about like roving gangs or insecurity cartels, not just in Mexico, right, but in different parts of the world where law and order break down. Are there any other things that threats you're worrying about?
Well, just to address that point, I've had that conversation with a few people asking, how long that threat would be in play. And almost unanimously, less than 4 months, because people want stability. If gangs are coming around, communities are going to get together to take law into their own hands to prevent that threat from coming back again. Like they're going to be the first ones taken out of the scenario. Yeah, they might get some food for a little time, but it's not going to take long before you hear those motorcycles coming up the road when a handful of people get together and like just start taking them out, and communities rushing together to do this, because our police forces will be non-existent at that point. Like you look at what happened in North Carolina, the looting started like just 4 days after. 4 days. I was expecting a week, something, it's supposed to be tight-knit community, everybody, up in the mountains there, really self-sufficient and thing. But down in Nashville, the looting started in 4 days. And I'm like, you're telling me in this world that we're existing in, that you don't have 4 days of food in your house? And this is in Asheville, not far up in the mountains, not somewhere where it takes 2 days on a mule train to get up there. In the city, all the world events going on, and you don't have 4 days of food in your house, and you got to go out and start beating up people and stealing their stuff because you didn't prepare. That's borderline insanity. And you start to look at how the world has, the media is telling people it's all okay, The biggest threat I see now is the unexpected events from the sun or the changing magnetic field, and in the human domain, how a weakening magnetic field would also affect the way we perceive reality or the way that we think, because your brain's electromagnetic and it's tied to our magnetic field, and our Earth's magnetic field is tied to the sun. So something is happening with there, and there's a huge amount of electric voltage coming in on our planet in those F layers, and that just simply means that boundary where space, quote unquote, stops. And there's this layer that those magnetic field lines, electric charge lines, come in and connect to our atmosphere. That's how we have charge all the way down to the ground. That's what Nikola Tesla was talking about harvesting. Down here near the ground layer, it's like 6 millivolts or so. But when you get higher up, it's substantial. You're talking about aurora coming in that are highly charged, and this kind of, electricity beyond anything you can comprehend of what we can produce on the planet. This is all and these layers keep getting supercharged, and it usually takes about 6 weeks, give or take, after a solar storm for all that captured, those electrons, protons, those particles up there that are holding in those layers. It takes about 6 weeks to move them out. But now it's just solar storm after solar storm where they never have a chance to release out, and it just gets more electrified and more electrified. So I'm just wondering on the ability, you were talking about, climate change, geoengineering. This is a one that I'm researching right now. Is people hear a lot about HARP, and I don't believe that is the cause of steering of hurricanes and how they can use that. So my idea of it is, and I'm trying to work with Jim Lee and ask him some questions a little bit. He runs Climate Viewer. Can they use the ionospheric heater? Because when they focus that electricity into the atmosphere, it creates a bubble at the ionosphere up there. So I'm wondering, are they able to, since all of the layers that are connecting in the higher atmosphere are incredibly electrified because of multiple solar storms, can they use HARP not to bend a jet stream, but to get beneath it, to bend it up so it connects with like the E layer at the bottom? And that jet stream connects an electrical connection between the E layer that allows more electrical focus to come running down into our storm systems. And this is why you're seeing this incredible electrical activity in the storms, the ferocity of the storms, the wind speeds, the size of the storms, the size of the rains, the hail size. That, if you could electrically induce that and create a much larger storm system by electrical means versus cloud seeding or something different. But the only mechanism that I think is possible to do that would be heating in a section of the atmosphere to push it up, not interfere with it, to push it up to get that electrical connection. And that it would not be possible either without all this highly, incredible activity coming off the sun with just, almost record-breaking solar storms just continuously. And there's another one coming in. There was an X3.3 just a day or so ago, and that's going to come rolling in. Because when I was up in West Virginia, they had red auroras up there less than 2 weeks ago. And now we have a full, that hasn't even dissipated yet. It's only been 2 weeks. And it takes about 6. But that was a major storm that came in, a hugely electrified event. That's why we saw aurora all the way down Tennessee, Florida, this thing. But now there's another one going to add on top of that. So none of this discharge pattern has taken place where it's been able to release. And it's just going to get another charge on top of it over this next weekend. So that's kind of my thing on the geoengineering side. I'm not really, okay, I understand there's carbon black and they can, do hyperconductive graphene and that sort of thing, cloud on the tops, usually at higher level, 40,000 foot or so. But this whole thing, that's the only way I can really, and I don't think they can start it from scratch and like direct it within 2 miles of where they want it to go. I'm not on board with that kind of, they can manipulate it, yeah, but they can't create it and control it. I'm not in the control side yet.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Joe Allen, who I'm very friendly with, been on the podcast. He wrote a great Substack recently, sort of fact-checking alt media that has gone too extreme. I respect Dane Wigington's work, but I think he's sort of in that camp where they are like gods, like Storm from X-Men, and maybe not. We have to be careful. I think there has to be nuance. I've interviewed Jim Lee on my TNT show, and got to get him on the podcast. And by the way, my fellow Croatian American Nick Begic out there in Alaska, the HARP guy, he's been quiet for a while. He just sent out an email that he's looking to do interviews again. So I'm going to see if I can get him on to get his thoughts on that. Beyond, we talked about relocating. We talked about basically having a farm. Any other thoughts on how to weather the storm? I talked to the retired Swiss wealth manager Clive Thompson the other day, and he recommended being diversified, having gold, silver, some crypto, property, and that sort of stuff. Having a network, I think, is really important. And any other thoughts on weathering whatever the heck is coming?
You're going to have to get one thing I could say, though, that I've learned from all this disaster that's going on in North Carolina, East Tennessee. You're going to have ham radios or communication device ham, because that's pretty much the way everybody was communicating and still is, because the ham network, they took mule trains up with their own antennas to reestablish the network up there after there was some damage. But a huge, huge amount. There were dozens, plural, of mobile phone towers that were washed away in the flash floods, never to be seen. That's on the mountains. And what happened in the cities and tributaries heading further down into the cities is something very different. I'm talking about the ones that were in the mountains that have spotty service anyway. Like, those were all wiped away. That's going to take a long time to get that area reconnected. But people were communicating by ham radio. And having that network that you know the repeaters, the frequencies of the repeaters, what time they're doing check-ins, and which ones they're going to be emergency broadcast channels. So if you have to do a check-in or wellness check for somebody, that you can hit the frequencies, that sort of thing. And electrical outages is another thing, because they keep trying to push us over to this wind and solar, which is very very unreliable, right? So it's almost on purpose that a regular, stable, reliable electric supply is being knocked out at the knees right along with the food supply. So if you're going to do any planning, you're going to think about electrical generation, and having a generator relies on the fuel source and a supply chain for the fuel. So you're going to have to go beyond that, because you can almost expect that the power is going to be going out at some point, either intermittently, 3 days at a time, 2 weeks at a time. Look what's happening in Cuba. How are they getting by that down there? That's a perfect example. But, how prepared are we for electrical outages? That's not widely talked about. Everybody talks about having food and having the water and that, straws and ways to purify water. Okay, that's like your base layer. But after you get that taken care of, you need to, at least this is where I'm also trying to, find my, open holes or cracks in my planning out here, is electrical production that's large enough, consistent enough that I can do on my own with the devices to run refrigerators and freezers. Because the amount of silver that's used and I'm trying to wind this back into the point here, because there's a huge amount of silver used in all of these solar panels, different types of green products, and your washing machine, your computer has gold in it too. But silver is going to be in more short supply, because you can't really recycle a lot of silver out of these devices. It's not cost effective at today's price, so it's not going to be recycled. The weapons that we use are always running silver in the circuits. And you come forward and there's new solid state batteries that are going to use 32 ounces of silver. You start to look at some of these things and go, all right, well, some metals may do better than others, but there's actually an industrial purpose for silver. So, how do you protect yourself? Which winds you back into, if they're trying to feed the world solar panels and they're cutting down our food production, our orchards, our vineyards, and this sort of thing, to put these windmills and on our crop producing fields. Those wheat fields, they're covered in windmills. You can't plant under there anymore. They're wiping out part of the food source by installing all this new tech on top. And that trend is going to continue. So the usage for metals will continue. But inversely, that the areas that they're scraping clean are our food growing areas to put the new tech on top. So you start to see there's duality moving forward. There's going to be more crop losses. Food's going to get more expensive because they're actually destroying the areas to grow food. And they're also installing the new non-reliable tech on top. So then you start to get these double layers of, how can I protect against that?
I've had a hypothesis, maybe run this by you, that maybe one of the reasons they sell us on man-made climate change, which ergo means us rationing, reducing our energy, forcing us to reduce our energy use, less food, less meat, less electricity generation, less use of cars. And now we're seeing at the same time AI all of a sudden pop up, and how AI will demand an insane amount of water and electricity in some states like Virginia. I've read that in Virginia alone, AI sucks 25% of the state's electricity or more. Amazon is now they're going into nuclear reactors, small modular reactors. On my TNT show 2 years ago, I had a nuclear Bitcoiner on who works in the Canadian nuclear industry. The archives are still up. He, 2 years ago, he said, this is the future. They're going to start rolling out small modular nuclear reactors. And so I'm wondering if they're trying to get us to use less energy because they're going to need that energy to run their AI, which will be the basis for like the algorithm ghetto, the smart cities. Does that sort of make any sense to you?
Certainly does, but you need the excuse. So if you knew in the 1990s, you had records stretching back 500 years that had been pillaged from across the planet. Vatican holds an enormous amount. Smithsonian, many museum, libraries, private collections, oligarchs, etc. They hold a vast amount of data that's not privy to the general public. Now, what if you knew that this cycle was coming back again, and the present way of life or present society that was that in place at that time wouldn't survive the change, just like the last 10 of these haven't survived. They re-evolve as a new iteration. Well, we're at that point again. Okay, well, you got to sit there in a boardroom and say, all right, well, really, realistically, in the next 30 years, we're not going to be able to salvage most of this. Economies will collapse. People are going to move. There's going to be huge population migration. Food prices are going to get really expensive because we're not going to be able to grow food as plentifully as we did. The yields are going to be way down, and the economy is going to be in shambles because the jobs and this sort of thing. And what do you think we could do? Well, everybody's going to see it with their own eyes in just a little bit. Give them 20 years, and there are going to be massive storms everywhere. So let me see. Let's feed them global warming as the excuse. Because if you knew this was here now, and everybody is seeing it with their own eyes, there's not one person that doesn't know that there's extremes to the Uber going across the planet right now. But if there was no excuse built in for that change, you might get a little nervous. But see, you got two birds with one stone on that one. What you described with the electrical use, got to use less, got to eat bugs, can't do this, stay home, no flying. And also, you're reducing electrical, but at the same time, these mega corporations running their dirty ships across the oceans. Hey, it's Christmas, buy two. Bits of junk going across the Pacific back and forth. Oh, buy two, it's Christmas. Oh, wait, you got to eat bugs because we don't want to pollute the planet. Well, wait, your factories are running over there and you want to make me to buy two because they're on sale and ship that stuff from China and you're telling me to eat bugs? No, your factories, those plastics facilities, I don't own one of those. That's a mega corporation microplasticking all over the planet. And then all this extra energy, what you said, like, we're not allowed to have the power and use it for anything because we have to sit here, and burn candles at night. Oh, wait, you're putting too much CO2. You can't even have a candle in your house any longer. You can only live in daylight hours and go back to the serfs. They couldn't afford candles either. And basically their houses and barns burned down when they used candles a lot. House fires. So you got to only work from daylight to sunset, and that's it. And you can't have anything else. This is the message they're giving us. But on the inverse, it's baffling how corporations can continue to pollute unabated. Nobody says a single thing. And then the electrical usage being pulled. And then, if maybe it is pebble bed nuclear reactors. And again, why are we not experimenting with some of these Tesla technologies? Or maybe they are going to roll them out with all this alien talk of aliens and this, that, and the other. Maybe it's a soft core way to introduce electrogravitics and levitation technologies without saying, hey, we screwed you for the last 120 years and made you go to work 40, 50 hours of work, pay your electricity and pay for that gasoline. You never needed that because people would be angry if they learned that,
Yeah, I could see them rolling out these alien psyops with these levitation technologies. I guess it's going to be a fun road ahead.
It is.
Any other thoughts, issues, or things that you want to get across that we should think about?
Well, I think that what you said right there is the most important point. This is a mind game moving forward. You can either enjoy the ride, and I've been scolded by many people like, how are you happy? And you're looking at all these things happening. I'm like, wait, I'm just processing the information and I'm looking at it as validation for how I see the world moving out so I can protect myself and move through the Rubik's Cube and maybe go through the maze in a different direction than you're going. And I'm celebrating these incredible events from the heavens and things that are coming out of just the vastness of, we're such a little tiny planet here, little tiny dot moving around. But these other things that are on a galactic, like more time frame, and understanding how electrical currents flow through space, and once they get and touch our planet here, how it creates these auroras, and the stronger those get, it just validates that the sun's magnetic field is changing on our Earth, which offers possibilities for manifestation. But again, you can look at this in two ways. Like, oh, the world's ending. I'm going to get under my desk and just like shake all day long. Or you can embrace it and go, I am so happy I'm growing my own food right now. I'm happy I got my orchard up 3 years ago. We already got fruit. We got peaches, we got apples, and got pears, heavy, heavy pears this year. I am so excited that we have chickens and ducks and that I have a place to walk around. Like the leaves are all changing now. After we finish here, we're going to go grab a couple glasses of wine and walk around the property and look at all the leaf change. Like I am super grateful and very, very thankful of everything I have. And I wouldn't have it or be in this position unless I was seeing these changes come and embracing them versus fearing them. Now, there's don't get me wrong. There's a level of when there's a flood coming down the hill, you need to get out of the way, or a landslide coming down. You can't just think, oh, look at the rocks rolling, so pretty. But there's a huge difference in embracing the chaos and embracing the change and making smart decisions out of knowledge versus fear. And I think that is the main takeaway. And you hit on it right there perfectly.
No, what you said, I love embracing the chaos. And I think there's a set of people who will say, oh, I'm too black-pilled or something. I think they're too afraid. They have too much fear. And, I'm coming from the biblical world where Jesus keeps saying, don't have fear, don't have fear. Stay away from the people that project this nonstop spirit of fear. There's a great meme that I came across the other day. It says, pessimist, glass half empty, optimist, glass half full, psalmist, like the Psalms in the Bible, my cup runneth over. So I'm a psalmist. And I think what you said, embrace the chaos. And I'm like a little kid in the candy shop every day, firing up the computer, looking at global events. And it's just like, you don't take it to heart. I'm just like, I'm in awe, basically. I'm in awe. I'm like, wow, look, that's happening. This is happening. I'm not afraid. And then as you say, you go, the sun is shining here in Mexico, going to have some coffee, go with the kids, go to the park, whatever. And so you don't let it get to you. And it's just, for me, it's amazing. As you say, it's just amazing to be witnessing this moment in time, everything that's going on. And so let me just ask you just one more thing. Any thought on BRICS? How important is it for you? What do you think about, they just wrapped up. Thoughts on BRICS?
We've definitely jumped into a new era. That declaration of moving to a trimetallic system of gold, silver, and palladium, and I'm sure they're going to include platinum, so it would be a quad metallic system as the base. And the real wealth is your resource traded for another resource, whether that's a ship of wheat for a ship of manganese. Those cross trades and anything that's an overage on that can be settled inside that BRICS currency. It's not going to be exclusively 100% used. But, to take the lion's share of global trade away from the US dollar, that's going to do some serious damage. Also, the Arctic routes, which I talked to Danny Sheckman many a time on this, where the Arctic routes seem to be really heavily influenced by technology increases and advancements. Like these super cold climates, you can't run most tires up there. Russians are up there, Chinese are up there, and they're trying to figure out really very hardy cold weather technologies, redoing any types of vehicles and shipping, setting up different towns up there to have cargo at a certain spot, just like you would do on the Silk Road. Approximately every 20 miles, they had an area for the animals to rest. The same thing. They're setting up transit points all across the Arctic outside the U.S. Navy influence. Like there's nowhere the U.S. Navy can get up through there. They're trespassing if they do. So these innovations and how a new system is being set up, again, when I'm looking at possible, I'll stay here as long as I can. But if this place is absolutely going up in flames where you're going to die in your chair here, just going, maybe you need to hit the ejector seat. And if you do, then I've never been to Kazakhstan. I keep reading about it. I keep seeing this amazing food over there. The meetings are there. I'm curious really what's there. Like there's some of these areas, and I only went out to Xinjiang when I was living in China. Didn't go out to like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and these kind of places, but that big, large mass right there in the center that seemed to be the next largest, let's say, settlement area people were heading to on the Silk Road to get to Almaty somewhere over there. It seems fascinating. You're winding back the clock multi-thousands of years of history and trade, and these areas are still very dynamic and economically prosperous after 4,000 years. So if you're looking at relocating, Would you not, and I would, consider a BRICS nation, knowing that these other nations that are like hooked on the US dollar, hooked on our mentality of control through war and death and destruction, moving over to maybe exist or live in one of these other nations, if you would even be allowed to with a US passport? I would say that. But the BRICS is, people go, well, they're never going to get it together, never going to. Okay, it started with 5 nations. Now there's over 120. You think they're not getting it together? They have meetings daily across the planet. I follow a bunch of news feeds on Twitter, or excuse me, on Telegram, and I get into the African news and into the BRICS news and this sort of thing. Every single day there are meetings going on across all of these nations. If you think they only have these big meetings once a year and they're not getting anything, we're just not getting the news. But this is a full court press, 24/7 across the planet of all these nations in unison. And where was the Congo, or was it Cameroon, that just said no more gold exports? We're keeping it all here for our base of the reserve currency. So no more gold exports coming out of the country. We're going to keep it here. We're going to build on top and create our own layer for BRICS to roll in for our own backstop. It's real. It's here. I don't know if you agree with that, but I mean, it's something significant, in my opinion. This is a world-shifting group of nations that are going to be an economic trading bloc.
The times, they are changing, as Bob Dylan would say. I'd agree with you. Despite my criticisms as to the nature of BRICS itself,
Yeah, right.
That's separate from what you're saying, the action. And so I do think the BRICS countries will, at least in the beginning, in the near term, economically, be growing and all that. And so, again, we're talking about survival. If you have to, why not go to a BRICS country? And I've lived in Kazakhstan, wonderful place. The winters, the cold it's brutal there. It is brutal, but you adapt to it. I don't mind the cold. I can do extreme cold. I've lived in a yurt in the Gobi in Mongolia, and so we got the David DuByne download here. Any final thought, and then you can let us know. All your links are in the description. Best places to your projects and best places to find you.
Yeah, thanks. Just one dovetailing remark on that. You're right. In the beginning, it's going to be very cooperative, and there's going to be a lot of peace between this, and they're not going to use militaries to run around the planet and dominate. Okay, in the beginning. But you're right. What happens 20 years after everything is fully established? 30 years after that, that's when you start to look down the road and go, are they going to mimic and repeat these mistakes in history that we have followed? So that was the end of that. But I have the Civilization Cycle podcast. It used to be called the Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. It's been rebranded. I got my co-host Ransom Godwin with me, and we discuss some of these very same issues for 2 hours at a time on our live radio show, Thursday nights, 10 p.m. to midnight on Revolution Radio. We break that down, cut them into 30-minute segments, and then put that out. There's a lot of people that are interested in why things are changing right now, and we try to discuss that the best we can. We don't have all the answers. We have a foggy crystal ball at best to look through, but we can look at history books and see possibly how that's going to allow us to move through the future, because nothing really changes under the sun, as they say. It kind of repeats, it rhymes, but you can get some glimpses of things that occurred in the past and how governments reacted, how populations reacted, and then you could get the same gauge, just move it up into our modern world. If the same event were to occur, they did this, we might very well do something similar. And that would give you a leg up on where to move, what occupation you might want to get in, what kind of groups you would want to surround yourself with. And then also the Adapt 2030 channel, speaking of the algorithm, still stuck there at 180,000 after how many years? Never really nudged up there, especially when you start, like we were talking about at the beginning of the show here, like why you don't believe in climate change is the official narrative of CO2. Once you can cleanly and professionally explain that by using peer-reviewed research that shows the complete opposite of what they're telling you, like then you start getting yourself in trouble. Like, oh, he's telling the truth. He's actually using peer-reviewed stuff to, knock the USA Today's talking points off their head there. So please come and join us. The website is civilizationcycle.com. We have show notes available. Just plug your email in there. So we'll give you the show notes, about 8 to 10 bullet points on what we run through in a show. Also, again, all the player list is there for you, and buy me a coffee, just like you were talking about. because it is getting more, I'm not going to say difficult. It's just you have to use different avenues now to, generate and have people support you and support your work. Before it was a little bit easier in 2014, 15 than it is now. There's more venues, there's more ways to disseminate information, but there's way more censorship as well. So buy me a coffee, Civilization Cycle, and please reach out to us if you want to have a chat or a conversation, civilizationcycle.com.